Hello, everyone. Good evening. Could someone on YouTube please confirm if I'm audible? All right. Thank you for the confirmation. So once again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Academy session. This evening, we will be hosting Mr. Marek Vanzura, who will deliver a talk on the reality of deploying autonomous vehicles for public use. He will take you through the following: about autonomous vehicles and their brief history, what it takes to deploy an autonomous vehicle for public use, technological, legislative, and public opinion challenges. Before introducing Marek, I'd like to take a moment to highlight an incredibly exciting upcoming workshop on driverless vehicles. Scheduled to commence from September 1, this workshop offers a unique opportunity to delve into the cutting-edge field. Be sure to secure a spot by registering before August 30th, as this is the final day for registrations. Now, moving forward, to tell you a little about Marek, he is currently engaged in pioneering research as a postdoctoral research fellow at George Mason University. As the former head of the Autonomous Driving Department, he demonstrated exceptional leadership by assembling and guiding a dynamic team of 7 researchers, seamlessly integrating qualitative and quantitative approaches. Notably, Marek's vision extended beyond his team, as he played a pivotal role in establishing the Autonomous Vehicle Research Department, contributing to the safe and strategic adoption of autonomous vehicles in the Czech Republic. Some general instructions for the audience on Zoom. Please mute your microphone throughout the session unless you are asked otherwise. We could encourage you to turn on your video and audio during the Q&A session to make the session more interactive. So without further ado, let's begin the session. Over to you, Marek.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for the introduction, and thank you especially to Ashar for inviting me for this talk. And let me first share my screen with you before I start. See if you could let me know that you can see it.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep.
Good. Well, thank you once again, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marek Vanzura, and yeah, in my today's talk, I'm going to talk about the realities of deploying autonomous vehicles for public use, and I would like to provide you with some, let's say, real-world experience with, efforts to put autonomous vehicle on public roads and effort to really use the technology, the current state of autonomous technology, for addressing some actual demands or needs of general public. So this will be the talk that I will be sharing, the experience that we obtained through actual deployment of autonomous vehicles. For that, I would like to initially start with some brief introduction into the world of autonomous vehicles and, to establish what we're talking about right now. And for that, I created this very brief, short slide where we can see some paradigm shift in a way that, engineers were addressing autonomous vehicles. Initially, in 1960s, we saw something that we might call like intelligent highway, which was the attempt to deploy sort of autonomous driving, autonomous vehicles using infrastructural help in form of electromagnetic wires buried in the road, which were used for guiding the vehicle, on the road, and basically allowing the vehicle to drive without any need of human input, human interaction with the steering wheel or pedals or any other control device in the vehicle. And these experiments using these electromagnetic wires and some detectors in the vehicles worked quite well. They were conducted in the US and in the United Kingdom, and the results were surprisingly good. It's like the vehicles were able to drive up to over 100 kilometers per hour, and even in severe weather conditions. So it worked, but the issue was this solution is very cost demanding. It's very expensive. If you imagine basically burying a wire, all around the road infrastructure, the cost is skyrocketing. It's extremely expensive to think about having, a transportation system using this sort of technology. So it was, slowly abandoned for basically nothing back in the day, because there was no other technology that could supplement, using this sort of device. So autonomous vehicles were put on hold for several decades, but the big change came around in 2000, when in 2004 there was the competition organized by DARPA called DARPA Grand Challenge, which was the effort to use autonomous vehicles using totally different approach. In this case, these vehicles were kind of understood as self-contained, self-sustainable agents. They had their own computational unit on board. They had all the sensors on board, and they worked as some sort of independent vehicle, independent, as I said, agent, which was able to navigate the world, was able to process all the information gathered from the sensors. And in this way, it worked as as we work. We collect the data through our senses, our brain processes them, and we act based on these things. So the idea was, let's try to use this sort of approach, because it was currently possible thanks to the advancements of microprocessors and technology. There is something called Moore's law, and using all these sort of things, we suddenly were able to move from the previous generation of using road infrastructure into new generation of, let's use the technology that's built in the vehicle and can doesn't need to rely on anything else, which in the end makes it much less expensive. So the idea behind the DARPA Grand Challenge was, okay, let's have this off-road stretch of road, and let's compete. Let's have several teams competing with their own autonomous vehicles against each other. Who will be the fastest to conquer this distance? It turned out that nobody really succeeded in the first round of the DARPA Grand Challenge. So there was another second iteration the next year in 2005, and in this case, several vehicles really completed the track, and it turned out that the progress in this sort of technology is really fast. We can deploy these vehicles in some conditions. And in the next 2 years, in 2007, there was another competition called DARPA Urban Challenge. In this case, the competition moved from off-road conditions to, let's call it, on-road conditions. Basically, there was a model of the city. There was like some test track that looked like a city, and all these autonomous vehicles together with human-driven vehicles were driving around this track. And the purpose was to test if these vehicles could potentially work in urban settings or in real-world conditions together with manually driven vehicles. It was again successful. Several vehicles completed the track, and it seemed like we are on the right track. We are on the path to deploy these vehicles in huge numbers on public roads. And as a result from this competition, many companies were founded. For example, Google established their self-driving car project, a department that later turned into Waymo. People who worked, on these DARPA vehicles, they established their own companies, either if it's Zoox, Torque, later Aura, Innovation, Cruise. There are plenty of companies that we see today that are working on autonomous vehicles, which have their founders or people who work there were actually working during DARPA Grand Challenges. So it seemed like, in 2007, 2008, around that time, that we're very close to actually having autonomous vehicles on the roads and using them for, addressing our needs and for everyday activities. However, it actually didn't turn out to be like that. And we are many years after, this success of DARPA challenges, and still we're kind of struggling to have some meaningful system of, autonomous vehicles deployed for everyday needs and uses of, of the general public. And I would like to elaborate more on why is it like that and what are the challenges for having some meaningful deployment of autonomous vehicles for public use. I basically segmented these challenges into 3 categories. These are broad categories, and I will talk more, about their details further on. So the first challenge, that is the most obvious one and also the most important one, is technological challenge. In this case, technology, the autonomous driving system, needs to work extremely well, because if it doesn't work well in all, under all conditions, under all weather conditions, road conditions, traffic conditions, then we can't really have safe system. So that's the first absolutely fundamental, crucial piece. The second challenge that autonomous vehicles has to face is legislation or regulation. So this means that in order to have, viable, meaningful deployment of autonomous vehicles, there needs to be suitable regulation in place. Without it, it's basically illegal to operate these vehicles on public roads. And as you might know, working with the governments and regulators is a long process. It doesn't really, work as something. You submit something and it resolves itself by, a few weeks. It takes a long time. And finally, the last challenge, or third challenge, that I will be talking about are public opinion challenges. This means that for successful deployment, you need to have, the general public on your side, which means the attitudes of people, they have to be favorable for the deployment of this new technology, and they need to feel that you're addressing some of their needs. If they don't feel that, if they don't see that, your tech is addressing their needs, then you won't likely succeed. So let me dive deeper in each of these categories. Technological challenges, as I said, for this, you need to have technology that works really well under basically all possible scenarios across, all road environments, across all weather conditions and traffic conditions. This means that, let's say it this way, there are different, categories of road conditions or different ways we can treat this. Basically, the simpler the environment, the easier it is to deploy autonomous vehicle. That's the reason why we see, many deployments in, let's say, like some technology parks or hospital areas, or, some logistic parks and so on, because this environment is usually enclosed. There is limited access to, these areas by, other road users or, other vehicles and so on. So it means that if the environment is simple enough, with the current state of the art, current technology, you can basically successfully run some deployment. But if the environment is getting more expensive, more complex, or more, difficult, then it's more challenging to really address all these, difficulties that you have to face. So from like closed environment, we can see that, next relatively little complex environment is, let's say, highway, because highway again has some limited access. You shouldn't go there, on a bike. You shouldn't go there on an animal. You shouldn't walk there. So suddenly there are many restrictions that allow you to operate vehicle there with some assurance that you won't encounter something that is really difficult to deal with, which is typically pedestrians, cyclists, and all these users that might be difficult to detect and predict their behavior. So that's the reason why we can see that plenty of current vehicles have some advanced driver assistance systems like lane keeping assist or adaptive cruise control, which are like partial automation functions, but they can allow you to operate vehicle with some automated functionality. So highway is relatively a little complex environment, but if we extend the scope to urban environments like city streets and all these very complex, complicated environments where plenty of different road users are meeting each other. So you have pedestrians there, you have cyclists there, motorbikes, even you can see horses or the animals moving through the traffic. And then suddenly the vehicle has to detect all these users, and because they are so different in their behavior, the vehicle needs to predict how they will behave, what they will do, and how the vehicle should move through them, which is extremely difficult. And that's the reason why deploying autonomous vehicles in these environments is so slow, because you need to make sure that all the components, starting from the perception through prediction until really actually making decisions, all these parts work perfectly. So that's difficult. Another part of technological changes is that you should comply with industry standards. Typically, it's our ISO standards like 26262, which is like the golden standard that autonomous vehicles, try to comply to. But there are also many other ones, and all this needs to work in order to be actually able to deploy autonomous vehicles on public roads. And considering this, it's suddenly no wonder that we don't see some massive deployment of these vehicles. And another reason is also we need to take into account the not road conditions, but weather conditions as well. So that's why we see vehicles deployed in places like Arizona, where the weather is stable all year long. There are no like big excesses of the weather, and you have little rain, you have almost no snow. So this is another simplification for the autonomous driving system that allows the vehicle to drive there without too many issues, and basically brings you closer to having something meaningful, some service that can be actually used. But these technological challenges, they are not the only thing that is holding autonomous vehicles back. The other one are legislative challenges. Again, as I said, we need regulations because public space, public roads are regulated by laws, and they are basically, there's a long history of laws that are governing different aspects of our lives, and roads are one of these environments that are governed by some sort of law. And it's true that for most of the world, the laws are not really suitable for vehicles that are not driven by humans, because majority of the laws all around the world think that there is human being behind the steering wheel. So this means that if we want to deploy autonomous vehicle, we need to redo these laws. We need to redo regulations. We either need some special permits. We need to some temporary additional kind of regulations, or we need to rewrite the law completely, which is a very long process. It takes a lot of time, and also you're facing some opposition from, let's say, legislators, policymakers, people who create these laws. The status quo is like, we have something right now, it works, so why should we change it? And there is always some fight and struggle that you have to go through. You need to convince these policymakers that it's necessary to change it, or we should change it. You need to present good enough argument why we should do it, because the benefit of autonomous vehicles is not really self-evident. So this takes a lot of effort, a lot of activity to really convince policymakers to start doing something in favor of autonomous vehicles. So this is very long process, and also it's not unified. When you look all around the world, there is no single law that would be governing every country, and road traffic laws for every country in the world. So it's very different, and basically each country needs to address it individually, which is another reason why it's taking so long. And we have some let's say progressive countries like Germany or the United States, which are trying to come up with some meaningful regulation as quickly as possible. In the case of the United States, there are different states, so there is no like federal legislation that would be overseeing every state in terms of autonomous vehicles, but each state is developing their own regulation, which again complicates the situation, and there is no unity in between these areas. And also in this case, there is some need to make sure that technology complies to industrial standards, because these standards are many times reflected in regulations, or they are sort of cooperating with each other. And all these things together, they're creating a huge challenge for deploying autonomous vehicles. And as I said before, you can avoid this by deploying in let's say closed environments, on some private roads and so on. So there are some ways around this, but again, it limits the effectiveness or usability of autonomous vehicles, because you kind of limit yourself to some easier environment. In this case, it's easier in terms of you don't need some special regulation to be in place before deploying something. But if we talk about real benefit of autonomous vehicles as it's presented, then we are talking about use of these vehicles on public roads, and then we need really to have these legislative challenges addressed. And finally, we have public opinion challenges. This is something that might not be seen as maybe too big challenge, but in fact it's absolutely crucial, because if people are not interested in using these technologies, then no matter how wonderful it is, no matter how great it is, nobody will be interested in using it. So we need to make sure that we come up with use cases, we come up with the ways of deploying these vehicles that actually address human mobility needs. Because if it works perfectly, but it's not really functioning in some area where people would use it, then it's missing the point. And actually, this is quite challenging, because considering the current state of the art of autonomous vehicles and the actual mobility needs of people, there is not really a huge overlap, because people usually need to transport or travel through some environments that are quite challenging. Let's say through through the city, and as I said, city is really challenging environment. So this is quite challenging. And it's another thing that we can think about is many areas in the world already have, wonderful transportation system. And if you're trying to propose or introduce autonomous vehicle, you have a huge work in front of yourself in terms of, showing and proving that, if you're trying to replace some already existing system, there needs to be some superiority in your own solution, because if there is none, then there is no reason, for changing the already existing system. And, these benefits or superiority, they can be in many areas. It can be cheaper, it can be, faster, it can be more efficient, it can provide, more options. You can think of, plenty of reasons why, the new system could be or should be better than the already existing one. So there's a lot of thinking about what's better about autonomous vehicles than, what we already have. And in many situations, in many cases, it's very difficult to find something. So this is one option. The other option is, we can take some area which is not really served by already existing, mobility options, and we can propose that we will deploy autonomous vehicles there because there is probably some demand, but there is really no supply there, and autonomous vehicles would address that. But it turns out that this is also quite challenging, because if there is some demand, then there is usually already something that, works there. So really finding some area that you could deploy autonomous vehicles and it hasn't really been utilized by some other transportation mode, it's quite rare. So in the end, you're ending up with having very narrow zone that you're trying to find that will be possible for your technology to be addressed, and at the same time it meets with the demand from, the general public, from users. So this is really hard work to find, this like middle line that, you could work with and have somebody, paying you for doing it. So all these three areas, technological challenges, legislative challenges, and public opinion challenges, create a big, let's say, obstacle for, successful deployment of autonomous vehicles. And if we think about all of these things, then we might end up, realizing that even though the field of autonomous vehicles is moving forward and it's moving forward continuously, we can see, improvements all over the years that, the capabilities of autonomous vehicles are, apparently getting much better. Then, there is still a long way for this sort of technology to be perfected, to really work in a similar way, similar fashion as, our current transportation systems work. And although we might be, sometimes deceived by all these marketing departments and efforts of many, developers to present themselves as having already something that is perfect, something that works flawlessly and can be deployed, tomorrow. The fact is that we don't have anything like that. We have autonomous vehicles that work more or less, successfully fine. The technology is very advanced, but as I said, it's not perfect, and there are still, things to improve. And it's not just technology, but also as a legislation. We are still waiting, in many countries for something that will fully address autonomous vehicles. And also, this is the continuous struggle and battle. There is this effort to convince or show or prove to the general public that this new mode of transportation is something that has benefits for them. It's not just, technology for the sake of technology, but it's technology that can actually improve the lives of, people. And this is really challenging and still something that's ongoing and will take many more years. So that's all from me. I'm grateful for your time and attention. And if you have any question or comment or anything, feel free to ask and say, and I will be happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marek. To all the viewers via YouTube and even to the participants on Zoom, if you'll have any questions, y'all can put them forward now. We'll keep the session going for another 5 minutes. If we don't have any questions, we can always collect them and forward them to Marek to get them answered. Okay, I don't seem to see any queries on YouTube, and I'm guessing everyone's pretty clear about what was mentioned. So, Marek, that was a great session. And oh, there is a query that has come up on Zoom. So it's from Ubedullah, and he says, "Good evening, sir. I had done my bachelor's in automobile engineering. So I want to ask, in which stream should I continue my master's for specialization in autonomous vehicles?"
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are so many different streams, that you go to. One huge area is sensors for autonomous vehicles. It can be either, like working on development of sensors, but also what is really important is like placement of these sensors and all the, like construction or design features of sensors, how to properly design cleaning of these sensors and how to properly, design placement in terms of like, their emitting properties. So sensors are, huge area. Another area that you can consider is more towards like the construction of the interior of vehicles, because what's currently being investigated is, once we have self-driving vehicle, once we have vehicle that drive itself, and we don't need, steering wheel, pedals, and all these, typical control mechanisms, then we can start thinking about having the vehicle, designed, the interior of the vehicle designed very differently. Like we can have, different seating arrangement. And suddenly, it means we have completely different construction of the interior of the cabin. There are, for example, if we consider crash tests or, crashing in general, there are different forces that are being, placed upon passengers if they're not sitting in the same way as they sit right now. So, for example, airbags placing should be different. Seatbelts work differently when, person is not sitting in the standard sitting position. And all these, things, or some deformations, zones, crumple zones, all these things, need to be addressed and redesigned in a way that will allow us to achieve the same, crash worthiness. So this is another huge area. And also, we can think more, this is more towards like, let's say, software engineering, but all these, perceptions, predictions, and these, decision-making processes that are done by autonomous vehicles, that's another huge area. But yeah, this is more towards, let's say, software engineering. So I would say sensors and, like, let's say, design of interior, or even sensor placements. These are definitely huge topics and areas in let's say car design or car engineering that I can see as potential places where to go.
All right. Thanks, Marek, for answering the query. If anyone else has any questions, you all can feel free to unmute yourselves. Okay. All right, then. I guess we can wrap this session, and I would like to thank you, Marek, for taking the time to do this. And I really appreciate this informative presentation that you put together. And if there are any queries, of course, I will direct them towards you. Thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. And to all the participants on Zoom and YouTube, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure having all of you on board. And once again, Marek, it was a pleasure having you too. And I hope we can stay connected and do something more fun in the, like, maybe in the same domain and stuff, and do something more for the students. So thank you once again. And we shall end the meeting now. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.